Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the 28th William and Miriam Blake Lecture in the History of Christianity. I'm Andrew Crislip, and I'm a professor here in the VCU Department of History, and I have the honor of holding the Blake Chair in the History of Christianity. This really feels so great to be back here in person, holding this event in our fully embodied forms with our VCU history community, our students here, families, friends, old colleagues, and our generous supporters. I think this is the first event that we have had in person as a department since everything went dark 2 years ago. So this is really, feels to me like a sea change for me in this department, and I'm looking forward to so many more of these. Now, for this, our 28th installment of the Blake Lectures, for the first time, we're both here in the flesh, in this beautiful space in Cabell Library, and also via live webinar. So also welcome to those of you around the region and from some distant places in the world who are joining us live via Zoom. Let me first say a few words about the lecture series, because I've even gotten some questions tonight about how long this has been going and what it is. The series was endowed by Professor Bill Blake's students, friends, and family in the early 1990s to celebrate Dr. Blake's decades of teaching in the history of Christianity at VCU and even before that at Richmond Professional Institute, as well as the impact Bill and Miriam have had in our community at large. Over the series' past 3 decades, VCU has hosted experts throughout all of the areas of the history of Christianity across time, geography, culture, and methodology. Alongside the department's other series, such as the Greer Lectures, the Society of the Cincinnati Lectures, the Alexandrian Society, History Now, and the Blake Speakers Series, the Blake Lectures are, at least for me, an important part of the life of our department and a thread of remembrance and a celebration of the intellectual life of our department and our engagement with the public. This year, sadly, among the many losses of the past year, Mrs. Blake passed, survived by a large family, many of whom are here tonight. And it was such a pleasure to reconnect with them at dinner with Dr. Blake and his family, who I've come to know over the last 14 years. So I want to recognize Bill and Miriam's contribution to our intellectual and spiritual communities over many years, and to thank them and the other extremely generous donors and supporters, named and unnamed alike, who've made this series and this chair possible and have endowed the study of history of Christianity at VCU for the future. Now it's my opportunity to introduce this evening's distinguished lecturer. Dr. Sylvester Johnson is the founding director of the Virginia Tech Center for the Humanities. He's a professor in the Department of Religion and Culture, assistant vice provost for the humanities, and the executive director of the Tech for Humanity initiative. He received his PhD from Union Theological Seminary in New York City, not the one up the road that Dr. Blake got his PhD from. Okay. And before moving to Blacksburg, he has held faculty appointments at Florida A&M, Indiana University, and Northwestern University. His first award-winning book was The Myth of Ham in 19th Century Christianity, Race, Heathens, and the People of God. And this traces sort of the readings of race in the divisions, the story about the divisions of nations among the sons of Noah in the book of Genesis. He followed this with African-American religions, 1500 to 2000, colonialism, democracy, and freedom. His more recent work has turned to the intersection of religion, race, national security, and technology. In 2017, he published The FBI and Religion, Faith and National Security Before and After 9/11, and this year sees the release of his edited volume, Religion and US Empire. He's a founding editor of the Journal of Africana Religions and is the author of scores of essays, articles, and reviews in his 25+ page CV. His current project, which he'll speak about tonight, addresses the implications of technology and artificial intelligence for religion and spirituality in our racially diverse postmodern world. And after the events of the past 2 years, this topic strikes me as extraordinarily prescient. So it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Professor Johnson to deliver the 2022 Blake Lecture in the History of Christianity.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and for this invitation to be able to join with you. I want to give special thanks to Professor Frislip, who extended this invitation, to Andrea White, who helped make these arrangements, lots of others in the background of making this event possible. It was a real pleasure to be able to meet Dr. White, Dr. Blake, and be able to talk with you about what led up to this event. And thank you for the seeds you planted, the work you've done that has inspired this series of lectures. To all of you, I want to underscore Professor Frislip's point about being able to join in person. Most of us now know the phrase Zoom fatigue. We understand how tough it is to, back in 2 years ago, we would try to hold 8-hour meetings on Zoom and quickly realize that we could not replicate exactly in-person events on Zoom, even though we have relied on it. But to all of you, those of you who are joining remotely, and those of you who've taken time to be here this evening in person, thank you for coming. I look forward to your comments and your questions as we go through this evening. I want to take just a small amount of time to present some of the themes and some of the arguments and questions that I'm working through in the book that is tentatively titled, Do Robots Have Souls? But that's trying to understand the intersection of technology, particularly digital technologies that are iterating through various applications of intelligent machine architectures in order to understand some questions that have been long-standing. I like to call them big humanities questions that go with this. They don't belong to a discipline, of course. If you know anything about the history of Christianity, you know that these thinkers and writers, if we could bring them here and resurrect them and have them work at our universities, would be very befuddled by our departments and how we've divided up things that they could teach in any number of them. But these are classic questions about the human condition that have been part of the teaching, the practices, the wrestling to understand such ultimate concerns. And so I want to talk about some of the intersections of developments in the history of religious traditions, particularly intersecting in ways that bring to surface important observations about the politics of race, and even pondering in a series of lectures about the history. I want to even use a bit of futurity, which we don't know about, but which we can try to anticipate, in order to reflect in a more precise way on the importance of some of these historical questions by asking this question: will robots, or could robots, feel pain? And in trying to be a good academic, I want to not forget to pose an answer to my question, because usually I do that, finish a thing and don't answer. So I will answer this question by saying, perhaps. Okay, that's where I'm going, perhaps. That there is nothing inherent to the nature of material entities that would exclude them from the capacity to experience pain. So that's what I want to very humbly offer. And I also want to point out just the shape of the talk. So I want to open with situating the question of pain in relationship to machines, and then biological humans. I want to reflect on the implications of one figure who has been incredibly important in the history of Christianity and Islam and Judaism, and that is Ibn Rushd, who's more commonly known as Averroes, to talk about his participation in an Aristotelian tradition that was trying to understand what made people people and what things could do by talking about the intellect. And then I want to move to the machine technologies that have been modeled on human biological paradigms in order to achieve some of the successes in machine intelligent applications, and to look at how that has been applied to trying to restore capacities in biological humans by combining them with machine systems. And it's that hybrid, it's that human-machine hybrid that I think can help us to figure out how to come at this. And overriding the book project in this particular talk is this effort to say that what is often represented as mostly, if not purely, an ontological problem, that is, what's the difference between people and things, is not merely an ontological problem, it's a political problem. Okay, so that's why politics is there in race. And by political problem, it's not just what constitutes things, but who gets to be included, who or what gets to be included in a political community of obligations of ethical considerations. So that's the gist of it. And that's where I'm trying to go. And that's me trying to be a good academic and just summarize where I'm going, what I'm doing, and try to answer my own question. So next few minutes, here we go. This is a slide showing some of the machines that were manufactured and sold by a company called Kinky's Dolls that in 2018, a Canadian-based company that in 2018 attempted to open a sex brothel, a robot sex brothel in Houston, Texas. And there was vociferous opposition to this robot sex brothel on many grounds. Not everyone was opposed to it, but the city council of Houston was deeply opposed and quite vocal in trying to stop this from happening. So the gist of the proposition is that this company offered humanoid robots, some of which are pictured here, for both purchase and also for by the hour rentals, so that what they figured as a normatively a male, cis male, heteronormative audience or clients, male clients could go in and they could pay for an hour of time with these robots that were designed to and engineered to provide a experience of sexual pleasure for these male clients by the hour. And so they were doing two things. They were selling the robots and they were also renting time with them, okay? So a robot sex brothel. And very expensive robots. So these were AI-enabled that were engineered in order to be responsive to human actions and to provide sexual stimulation and pleasure to these male clients. And ranging from $4,000 to $5,000 to up to $10,000. The company had been successful in Canada. They're trying to open in Houston. And the city council eventually, what they did was to modify some of the existing language in the city ordinances in order to say that it was not legal to provide any sale of experience to create any sexual experience between a biological human and a machine that resembled a human, okay? And that was their way of trying to target this activity. So Kinky's Dolls was not able to operate the brothel. Now they were able to sell the robot, so you could still purchase the robot and do what you wish with the robot. But it was interesting to consider some of the responses. People indicated that they thought this would lead to the destruction of moral values. It would incite an explosion of moral vice, that it could habituate the gaze that men already had toward women, of objectifying them by reinforcing that with having men have sex with robots that were already objects. Maybe some voice that maybe men would lose interest in biological women, that they would no longer want to have sex with women because now they could have robots that would just replace the batteries or recharge them, and you could just keep going. And so not everyone was opposed to this, but there was overwhelming consternation about it, to put it mildly. And so this was an actual thing that happened in 2018. Now, this slide represents something that is fictitious, and I just want to emphasize that. So it's still based on the premise of a sex robot or sex bot. But it's a fictitious story entitled Mika Model. So Mika is the name in this fictitious story. That's part of a series of stories, by the way, that Slate magazine published as part of a collaboration between Arizona State University and the New America think tank, which is very invested in promoting public interest technology, how to get technology to work in ways that promote not just the interests of private capital, but also public good and public interest. And so this series of fictitious stories being provided to help people think about the ethical considerations of technology. So in this fictitious story, a series of sex robots, they're called Mikas, this is the Mika model as opposed to some other model, are highly engineered AI-enabled robots that sort of like the Tesla updates, you know how you can get your update over the air. The robots would update every night and they would share machine learning. You know, they are gathering information and improve the algorithm. So they would share their learning with the entire network. So all the robots overnight become even better at what they're doing. What they're doing, they've been engineered to provide optimal sexual pleasure to, again, this common idealized client of a cis male heterosexual client who have this particular stereotypical gaze on the female sexual subject. And in this story, one of the sex bots is leased. So you can't purchase these in this story because the leasing subscription model is the most highest revenue generating. So he leases a sex bot and he tortures a sex bot, beats it up because this is how he derives sexual pleasure. And the robot cries out in pain and asks him to stop. And he says, well, you don't actually feel the pain, you're a robot. So he continues. And this goes on for months. And eventually, after a continuing experience of torture, the robot kills the human subject because she has no recourse. She doesn't have legal rights. It's not like she can go to call the United Nations and say, or ACLU and say, I'm being victimized. She's a machine. But she's been engineered for sensation and pleasure and haptic responses. And so she kills this person, and then she goes to the police and turns herself in and says, I've committed murder. And there's a detective at work. She comes in and he recognizes after a minute that this is one of the sex bots, and to whom he finds himself attracted. And he says, well, that's ridiculous. You're a machine. You can't commit murder. So she says, well, I'll show you. So she takes him to the home of the client and he's beheaded. His corpse is on the floor, decapitated. And about that time, an executive from the company's, clearly spoiler alert, if you're planning to read this, it's still worth reading. But a company executive arrives, and what you see here in the image of a screwdriver in the eye of the robot is the corporate executive decommissioning this rogue machine. Something has gone wrong. So they take it out of service, and the detective is horrified, this screwdriver in the eye. And the corporate executive says, well, don't worry. He said, but you just killed her. She says, well, it's a machine. You can't kill a machine. So, we get two things. That machines can't get murdered, and they cannot commit murder, and they cannot be killed because they're just machines. And three things, actually. The first, if they don't actually really feel pain because they're machines, even though they've been engineered for sensation. Okay. And so it raises this question. But of course, this denial of the capacity of entities to experience pain is by no means limited to machines. It is actually probably more pervasive in the concern with human subjects. So in this image, we see an artist rendition of the birth of gynecology. So to your right, Marion Sims, a 19th century physician who created what we now know as the medical field of gynecology, of women's reproductive health. He created this field of medical practice and advanced knowledge about reproductive health by experimenting on Black women. And he created multiple methods for surgeries and interventions by denying these women any anesthesia and cutting into their genitalia. So as we are well aware, you have your highest concentration of neural tissues, of nerve cells in the genital areas. If you were to pick any part of your body as a site for torture, it's probably impossible to come up with a site that will create more painful sensation than the genitals. They were denied anesthesia. Marion Sims' contention was that Black people as a race were not really on the same status of being human as the white race. And so if they experienced pain, it was not truly a full sensation of human pain in the way that white people would experience. And so the insights and observations that he gained were able to benefit white women who did receive anesthesia. But he forcibly experimented and tortured more than 30 Black women. He performed more than 30 surgeries on Black women. And these Black women were enslaved. So they had no recourse to any kind of legal protections. Of course, they expressed their pain and torture, but he simply denied that there was any true validity to the scale of their pain that would approximate that of a true human experience of pain, or a full human experience of pain. Into the center, what this artist has depicted is one of those women named Archa. And she is represented here in a very dignified pose, but there was nothing dignified about the torture that she and other women experienced. To your right are the white male observers who were invited by Sims to actually learn from his experiments on these women. And then to your extreme left in the background are two other Black women who are there peering over. So the artist tries to bring some dignity to the life of these women while also trying to represent the very difficult and on multiple levels painful past it represents. But the whole idea that there are some entities for whom pain might either be a diminished reality or a non-existent one is in no way limited to the way people have tried to represent the life of things. It is very much about how humans have interacted with one another. And so what I have suggested here is that pain, like human, is not merely a biological or strictly scientifically taxonomic category. It's also a political category. It is also one that has operated in many ways at some point, the category of the human, for instance, to exclude at some point in time, most people on the planet through whatever vectors of race or gender or colonial status or sexuality, because of this ability that we have as human beings to recognize or show recognition or to deny it based on many different kinds of parameters. But pain operates in that same way, and it has a very important history. And it has become, for me in the book project, an important way of trying to understand what is at stake. We were trying to recognize something fundamentally about personhood and the human condition and the capacity of things to experience or not things that we consider human. So Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes, was a legal jurist, a Muslim scholar who was celebrated among Latin Christians as the father of secularism because he developed and popularized understanding a theory of truth that validated and affirmed, of course, revelation as a source of truth, that one could know God, that humans had this capacity to receive divine revelation and know truth. And also in parallel to that, validated and affirmed in his theory of truth a secular approach to truth that he called philosophy, that you could use philosophy in order to get at divine truth without depending on divine revelation. And this was very influential. It had many impacts, and his participation in this larger tradition of trying to understand the nature of the soul, in particular the nature of the intellect as a special power of the soul, was very influential, even on later figures, iteratively, of course, such as Descartes, who ended up taking this in different directions. For Ibn Rushd, it was Aristotle's work, Hypsuke in the Greek, Danama in the Latin. In English, we say the soul, usually. That work was very important because in that text, Aristotle tried to explain what makes things alive. And in this Aristotelian tradition, anything that's alive has a soul, according to Aristotle. So plants have souls, frogs have souls, trees have souls, humans have souls. If you're alive, you have a soul. Because living things die, Aristotle disagreed with many of his contemporaries by asserting that souls are not eternal, they are temporal, and then they die, they cease to function. A better translation of this may be the animator. The things that are animated have an animator. There's something that is their life force, is that life power. And then there were different kinds of souls and different kinds of powers. And Aristotle claimed that the ability to know was something unique to the human soul. A tree might sense sunlight, for example, but a human could know that it was springtime or summer. So Aristotle will say, yeah, you see a tree blooming in the spring, but if you could speak tree and walk up to the tree and ask the tree what season it was, the tree would have no idea because it's just sensing thing, it doesn't actually know anything. And so this is sort of the context for that. But Ibn Rushd wrote multiple commentaries on Danama, and it's his third commentary, which is his longest, where he innovates most extensively in trying to apply this Aristotelian tradition to understanding the intellect. What is the intellect doing when it's intellecting? And one of the things that he emphasizes in this tradition is quoted here, that the intellect is neither a body nor a power in a body. And the gist of that is that he wanted to emphasize that the intellect could not be a material type of entity. So if you ask Ibn Rushd, well, does the brain understand anything? He would say, well, of course not. The brain can't actually know anything. It's the soul that has the power to know. Okay? And these physical things, the physical apparati, have some role to play. But when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to understanding, when it comes to intellecting, that cannot be a material entity. And so I'll try to summarize why he made that claim. By taking the example of seeing a tree, based on the descriptions that he provides about material entities and the role of the physical body, and then what he understands to be an inherently and necessarily unique capacity of the soul. So in this schema, by the way, many of you are familiar with this. If you're not, I'm just trying to summarize quickly. We're dealing with hylomorphism. From the Greek hulos, and morphe, hulos meaning material, and morphe being form. So in this Aristotelian tradition, things are composed of two types of substances, material substances and then immaterial substances. And to give you an example that's not a perfect analogy, but is a helpful one, in the 3 minutes remaining, I'll try to summarize this. If you think of a cake, right? If you eat a cake, or if you don't eat cake, apologies, don't mean to offend you, but just kind of bear with me. You can think of it as a tofu cake or something. But the cake that you can touch, taste, feel, put in your mouth is material. And if you think about a recipe, the recipe orders the materiality of that cake and its constitution. It's not just the ingredients that are in it, but you also have to cook the cake, for example. If you don't cook it, you just have cake batter. You don't have cake. So it orders that materiality. The cake is material. The recipe is not made of any material. You can write it on material. You can write it on a piece of paper. You can write it on a, almost said floppy disk. No one knows what that is, but you can write it on a hard drive or in the cloud. You can put it on some medium, but the piece of paper or the book that it's in is not the recipe. Okay, the recipe itself does not have material, but it governs the material. It is responsible for making possible the Constitution. And that's that hulas, the material, and the morphe form. So in this example, the cake is the hulas, is the material. And the form, the morphe, is the recipe. So when you put the hulas and morphe together, you get this hylomorphic understanding of the world. So that's one thing that is the context for what he's explaining. So there's a tree, it's a material entity. So how does the intellect know that a person is seeing a tree? So he says, well, there's ocular sensing involved. So he makes this distinction between sensing and knowing. So the eyes are involved, they receive light that's bouncing off that object. And then several things happen based on the inputs that the material, in this case, the ocular apparati, are receiving. The images, or the vision, the light that's being bounced off, is broken down into multiple images that the imagination is responsible for. This is why we have the word imagination is based on image. And whether it's a sound, by the way, or something you see, or something you feel, the imagination still produces images of those things. And it strips them down in Ibn Rushd's analysis into more elemental images. And this allows different kinds of images to be related to each other. So if you see an apple of one particular brand of Macintosh apple, it might remind you of a Fiji apple, because they're different images, but they have apple parts to those images. Or if you hear a song that reminds you of a song, they're broken down in different kinds of images. The memory is able to refer to those different images and to make connections between them. And that's how you're able well, the images are dismembered and then they're put back together, right? So this is why you can member them again or remember them. You can put them back together again. And that's what memory is doing. It is remembering things that have been dismembered. And then there's active and passive intellect. And it's at this point in the process that Ibn Rushd explains the move from having material types of things that are due to operations of material entities, parts of the body, okay, the brain and the organs, the eyes, and a move to being able to perceive the essence of whatever is being seen. In this case, the essence of a tree. And in order for that to happen, there has to be some part of the human's constitution that is not a particular kind of material thing. Now, why is that? So you may have heard of the saying, viewing the world through rose-colored glasses. And what that saying is that if you're wearing rose-colored glasses and you walk into a room that is gray or even yellow, it begins to look rose-colored because you already have color in your lens, which means that your ability to perceive color is fundamentally confounded, because you can never know the colors that's there because you already have color in your equipment. Or if you're trying to perceive texture, think of trying to feel the texture of furniture wearing a glove that is furry on the inside. And what you will feel, whether you're touching a golf ball or a basketball or a car, is furriness, because you already have texture in your equipment, in your apparatus. If you want to perceive color, you can't have any color in your lens. If you want to perceive texture, you can't have any textureness in your tactile equipment. In other words, because material entities always have particularity, you cannot have a material entity that is actually understanding what you're seeing. It's just going to inject its particularity into your experience, and you will never have an objective encounter or experience of the world, okay? And so if you can understand why wearing rose-colored glasses is the wrong way to perceive color, then you can understand why Ibn Rushd is saying that the intellect cannot be a body. It cannot be a material entity. And it cannot be a power of a material entity. It cannot be a capacity of a material organ. It cannot be a capacity of the brain or the eye or nerve cells. It has to be a capacity of something that is not material, so that it does not inject its own particularity into your experience of the world. And that's why the intellect is a power of the soul, because the soul is something that is not material in this tradition. Now, I say this to try to summarize something that's very complicated in this and extensive in this, this long commentary of the Anima, not to promote what Ibn Rushd is arguing, because I will actually disagree with him. And he doesn't care. He's already been far more influential than I will ever be. But because the way that he gets to his answer is so instructive. I mean, here's a legal jurist who is dealing with optical physics and trying to understand plant physiology and human physiology, and is trying to understand the relationship to that, to particular and objective knowledges of the world. And the point is that by the time you understand that you're looking at a tree, you have a category that's called a tree, for example, even though none of us have ever seen a universal tree. The only trees we've ever seen are particular kinds of trees. But all of us have a category called a tree. And Ibn Rushd would say, and the other Aristotelians would say, well, that's because the essence of the oak tree or the pecan tree is that treeness. And that's what the soul is perceiving. It's able to get to that morphe, it's able to get to that true form, and it is unimpeded by any particularity, okay? So that's why it's so important to have what we see as this continuing consternation with what's often called the mind-body problem or dualism, or this wrestle between materiality and immateriality. It's not a silly argument. I disagree with where the dualists are going. I'm gonna try to suggest something different. But I have learned from, and I'm trying to be a student of the way that they get there, because it's actually very rigorous and humbling to think that we still don't have ultimate answers to these questions. I'm going to suggest something here, however. So here is a sketch of a neural cell, and these nerve cells, they get excited and they transmit electrical patterns when they're excited and stimulated. Now, with pain, there are certain kinds of receptors, or nerve cells rather, called nociceptors. And these nociceptors have been understood through studies of human physiology to be particular kinds of neural cells that get stimulated only, here's the thing, only when humans experience things that are probably harmful. They're not always harmful, but they're probably harmful. What we know about the stimulation of neural cells is that these cells, they have two kinds of parts. They're dendrites on one side and axons on the other, and every nerve cell has this. The dendrites receive signals from another cell's axon. So if there were another cell over here to your right, it would be receiving, it would get excited when it receives stimulation from the axon of the cell. So the axon acts on the dendrites of another cell. And when one excites another, all that's happening, I shouldn't say all, but what's happening is an electrical pattern, okay? So if you think of a child learning to speak, and they learn that an apple, that the word apple refers to that object, that fruit, what's happening is that the nerve cells that get excited when they hear the word apple from their parents begin to build a physical connection to the nerve cells that get excited, that have this electrical signaling when you show them the object. It's just a physical connection between those two communities of cells. And as they create more connections, the communities of cells that get excited when you say apple, and the communities of cells that get excited when you show them the object, as they build connections, we call it learning. That's what we say. We say the child has learned that the word is the object. But physiologically, what's happened is that those communities of cells have reached out and started to build connections to each other. Okay? So that's called synapses, when those things are connecting to each other. These particular cells, the nociceptors, they get excited, again, only when they are stimulated by things that are usually harmful, but not always. Now, this is the other issue with pain. What is painful for some people might be pleasurable to others. Not only that, But pain is really, it's a very complicated kind of phenomenon. It has become a very controversial phenomenon, particularly interspecies. Until about 2010 or 2011, no major biologists would lean into the claim that fish, for example, could feel pain. It's not that no one ever suggested it, but Victoria Braithwaite, a British ichthyologist, an expert in studying fish, she wrote a book arguing not that all fish feel pain, but that a particular species could, because of how they were responding to tests to try to assess whether or not they had pain. Now, another reason why pain for me is important for this project is that it's like consciousness. There is no objective test for it. You can go to the world's greatest expert in pain management, and when you walk into their office, the world's greatest Nobel Prize winning, award-winning expert will ask you, tell me about your pain. They will not take out a painometer and measure your pain. They will ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is you can barely feel it, 10 is you're about to pass out. I mean, what is your pain? Even though they're the expert on pain, there's no way for them to measure your pain. You have to tell them. It's like consciousness. It's purely subjective. And so we're not able to measure and validate pain in human subjects. We just have to ask them what they're feeling. All we can see, or we can detect electrical patterns, but that could be anything. It could be laughter, and the patterns could look like anything. We just have to ask them, what are you feeling? Is it painful? And on what scale? So that's just to contextualize the difficult. But she made this claim, and she received fierce disagreement from her colleagues in ichthyology. They said that this is not viable. There can be no claim in the methods that she used that fish feel pain. And so they rejected her scholarship. And it was really the 2020s, very recently, that people circled back to her claim. And one of the issues is that nociceptors in human bodies are not, they're not paralleled in the bodies of fish. We don't see those same kinds of structural cell configurations in fish. But those who were supportive of her findings said to the critics to deny that fish feel pain because they don't have the same type of cellular structures as humans is like saying that fish can't swim because they don't have arms and legs, because we know that's how humans swim, right? With arms and legs. Do you have to set the same equipment to perform the same activity? Or can you have the same kind of experience swimming, but you just do it a different way based on your particular physiology of your species? But the point is that it's a really difficult problem. And this is part of my point to say it's not just an ontological problem. It is a political problem. So a bit about the intelligent machine architectures and then the human hybrids, and I'll be done. So what you're looking at here is a slide that shows two examples of machine learning applications, intelligent machine applications, or artificial intelligence applications. And to the left is an image of something called Ibm Watson. This was a machine learning software architecture that was cloud-based that IBM developed back in, I think, 2012, 2013, 2014, and iterated it several times. And the aim was to be able to take the symptoms that patients presented with in a medical environment, have the AI examine those symptoms, and based on its ability to read hundreds of thousands of medical texts. And IBM emphasized, by the way, that Watson understood what it was reading. It could actually understand the medical concepts. It could figure out what was the most likely prognosis for that patient. And it would give the medical doctor, the human doctor, 3 or 4 options. If there's an 80% chance that this patient should be diagnosed with X, so a 35% chance that this patient should be diagnosed with Y. And the percentages were the level of confidence that the AI had in what it was recommending as the proper recommendation. But the point is that IBM Assist, it actually understands concepts. It's not just doing math, it's understanding. And so this is why IBM has chosen to refer to its AI as cognitive computing, that the machines actually do cognition. To the right is an example of a microchip that is a machine learning chip that is composed of about 5.5 billion transistors that are connected to one another to create, I talked about those cells connecting. to connect synapses. And just as different cells can learn to get excited by particular other cells, when I say get excited, they connect to them based on a certain pattern of inputs. When the child says apple, for example, in the same way, different transistors can be trained by feeding them data and showing them patterns. It's called machine learning with data training sets. So that certain digital cells, digital neurons, get excited with other digital neurons based on a particular pattern. And the result of this is approximately 256 million synapses. This is paltry compared to humans. You have about 100 trillion synapses. And what you do with your brain is doing is far more sophisticated chip, but it's the concept. It was the biological paradigm of creating these connections and creating what are called neural networks of machines that are based on the neural connections of human cells. And I'm going to show you a couple of images that are the results of this type of technology. When you have a machine learning process where you can have a machine to be exposed to different information, and it starts to find patterns. So you may be familiar with image recognition. Of a computer can figure out, you may have seen the game, picking out a picture of a cat or a dog. If you show it hundreds of thousands of pictures of cats or dogs, let's just say dogs, it'll figure out how to identify a dog regardless of which particular dog you're seeing. But what you're about to see is sort of the reverse of that. It is Google's, one of their AI software programs, shown hundreds of thousands of images and being told to create something it's never seen before. So I'm going to show you two images. One was created by a machine, another was created by a human artist. I want you to figure out which is which. So here's one, okay? And here's the second. So which of these do you think was created by a human and which by the machine? So this one was created, I'll tell you, it's created by a human. And this was created by a machine. And it's image recognition in reverse. Train a machine learning algorithm on hundreds of thousands of images, and then tell it to come up with something it's never seen before. And so one question to ask, another way to try to get at this, I've already told you that if you, remember I showed you the tree and I said that even though you've never seen a universal tree, you have a category in your head. And regardless of the particular kind of tree you're exposed to, you can put it in the tree category, even though there is no such thing that you've ever seen physically as a universal tree. Okay, it's a category that you develop conceptually. And so the machine learning creates outputs that seem to be the same kind of thing. You can show it any hundreds of thousands of pictures of a dog, and regardless of which dog you show it, it knows to put it into the dog category. But this is the reverse of that. And if you can say that a human is creative, even though their work is inspired by other things, if I take an art class and I learn to draw lines and shade, and then I create something on my own after copying other people, you can see elements of what I've seen before in what I've done. Or if I create a song, you can hear notes that are in other songs that I've heard, but I arrange them differently. And then that's called creativity. Could we say that these machines are creative? Just a question. And a more sophisticated example of this is the machine learning algorithm that DeepMind created several iterations of. This one is Alphago. This is a machine learning algorithm that taught itself to play one of the most complicated games that humans have ever developed, and that's Go. That has been played for centuries in China, that you can download on your phone, download the app on your phone tonight and play with it. You want to just understand how hard it is to play this game. So this AI taught itself by playing against itself thousands and thousands of times, and pretty quickly was able to defeat the world champion of Go, Lisa Dole, who's here. It lost before it beat him, but the point is that it did. And Garry Kasparov, a world famous chess player, watched this same type of software play chess. And Garry Kasparov wrote that it was like experiencing the actual truth of chess, that this software seemed to understand what the game was actually about at a level beyond what Garry Kasparov had ever seen any human do. Okay, that doesn't prove that machines can know truth, but it is one of the world's greatest chess players responding to this software by talking about truth. So this is the end. There are two slides here. This is Nathan Copeland. shaking hands with Barack Obama. President Obama is there. If you look, it's against a black background, but if you look carefully, Barack Obama's hand is shaking a robot hand. So Nathan Copeland is paralyzed from the neck down. He is implanted with a multi-array electrode developed by the True North Neurotech Corporation. That's part of the research that has been done for the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, in order to create ways for military soldiers who sustain traumatic brain injury to be able to have restored capacity, to walk again, to talk again, to be able to move their arms and legs, etc. And so what was called this BRAIN initiative really invested federal dollars in developing the ability to implant electrodes into the brains of injured soldiers so that they could have restored capacity. And the ambitions are far-reaching. Eventually, the aim is to be able to have people to have restored memory capacities and speech capacities by even perhaps, for example, preserving information in machine neurons that can then go into their brains so that they can have those capacities again to speak. But this is about movement. And the research for that initiative led to this multi-array microchip that's implanted in Nathan Copeland's brain. And you have to have brain surgery to put it in. You don't just tape it in. It's not an app that you download. And then it's trained on an AI. So whenever I think of doing this right here, that's a very particular set of electrical signals that my brain produces to do that. And every time I do it, it's the same signal. And if you do it, your signal is going to be a little different from mine, but you'll always make the same pattern for you when you do that. And because of that, you can train AI software to recognize these patterns. And eventually, you got the chip, it's trained on the AI. When his brain generates a pattern to, say, shake a hand, the electrode sees that pattern, perceives it, it replicates that pattern, and it sends that pattern to the robot hand. And the robot hand moves based on the pattern, so it does a handshake. But it's not just a one-way process, it's a two-way process. This hand is engineered for sensation. It sends back to Nathan Copeland the feeling of Barack Obama's shaking the hand. And it sends that signal to the electrode, and the electrode sends that signal to Nathan Copeland's brain. And Nathan Copeland feels Barack Obama shaking his hand. It's called closed loop brain-computer interface, or closed loop BCI. And he's been continuously planted since 2014, by the way. This is 2022, so he's had that chip in his brain for 8 years. And I'll end with this from Ibm Burkhardt, who had a diving accident that severed his spinal cord, paralyzed from the neck down in 2014, and also has a brain chip from the same company. Most of the brain chips that are installed in human beings today are from the BlackRock Neurotech Corporation. And he's playing a guitar. It's a funny looking guitar because it's a therapeutic guitar. He's playing that guitar. You may be asking, you just said that he was paralyzed from the neck down. How is he playing that guitar? Same thing. You know, he thinks about it. He has a brain chip that relays that signal to wireless receptors on his arm, and he's able to move those fingers to play that guitar. So I moved through this because what we see in this last example is what happens when you combine people with machines. Often when we're asking the questions about what things can do, what is the power of whatever is unique to humans, and in the Christian tradition, in many traditions, in fact, not all, but in much of the Christian tradition, particularly the soul, has been the site for trying to explain how we move from physical phenomena, from electrical patterns, to say the taste of chocolate, or the sound of music, or the sound of my voice right now. The sound that you hear is what your brain is creating, because all I'm sending out is compressed airwaves that produce electrical signals. But you have to take those signals and turn it into sound, and that's what you're doing. The sound that you hear, your brain is creating that in response to those electrical signals. They have to get interpreted. This is why you can swim in your sleep, hear people singing while you're sleeping, you can fly while you're sleeping, because you can generate the experience. You don't need external inputs or those things coming from the outside. You can generate it yourself. So how do we get from those material entities to what we call experience? And if we focus on pain particularly, how do we get to that from just some electrical patterns? And what I want to suggest
is that because we don't actually need some type of special substance to do it. This is part of what things do. This is why human neurons can talk to machine neurons, so that Ian Burkhardt can play a guitar and Nathan Copeland can feel President Barack Obama's hand. Because you don't need some special kind of capacity. I can't prove that, that's merely circumstantial evidence. But I think that if we move forward into this future of humanity and machines, trying to understand the questions that have been asked for thousands of years that we still don't know the answer to, then we have to come to a way of approaching it, and we consider that it's not just an ontological question, but also a political problem. Whom will we include and exclude from a political community of ethical obligation? Will we say that Ian Burkhardt is not 100% human because he's part machine and should not have 100% human rights? Will we exclude Nathan Copeland from being able to vote or do other things? Or will we say that as we move into this future, because the history of excluding, that the way we solve the political problem, excluding so many people, has been so destructive that we need a different kind of epistemology to move in this future. Because of that, we will actually have a much fuzzier, dare I say, more inclusive epistemology that has its own questions that I certainly haven't figured them all out, but would be essential for us to be able to have an ethical future for humanity, because it recognizes that what at first might appear to be merely a question of what are things made of is also a question of whom we're going to include. Thank you very much. I invite your vigorous dissent as well as your comments and questions.
Most of this was sort of scientific. Could you relate this to the nature of religion, and in particular Christianity?
Absolutely, yeah. So the particular importance of the soul is often, so one of the things I wanted to show in the book is that the concept of the soul can be easily dismissed in a very scientific worldview, although science is not, many scientists feel that science is under attack. And I don't want to say, oh, science rules the day, because that's clearly questionable. But it's certainly the case that our sensibilities have been shaped by centuries of scientific discovery. So we have science over here and theology over there. And if we try to understand the role of the soul in the history of Christianity, and Ibn Rushd, even though he's a Muslim intellectual, was actually most influential in the Christian tradition. And he was actually becomes the way that subsequent Christian theologians, either directly or indirectly, are trying to understand what the soul is and what distinguishes humans from non-humans, and how it is possible for the human to have a relationship with the divine and with divine truth. It is also rooted in, theologically, in a concern with what today we would see as biology or as physics. If many of these theologians, such as René Descartes, who is part of this genealogy, who is indirectly shaped by Ibn Rushd. Descartes did vivisection. And he's very famous. For those of us who may not be an expert, we may have heard, I think therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, that the ability to think and reason was something that was really unique to humans. And that very phenomenon of thinking and reasoning was part of what distinguished the human subject. And Descartes actually argued that human bodies are machines. The only thing that keeps humans from being merely a machine, Descartes wrote, is the soul. And the why of that is what I was trying to explain with Ibn Rushd, that if you want to have intellect, if you want to have truth, then you're dealing with a unique capacity of a human soul that other types of souls don't have. Or in Descartes' case, that nothing else, that humans have souls and those non-human entities do not. So it's a very different kind of departure from some of the tenets of the Aristotelian tradition while still depending on it. The soul throughout the history of Christianity is not uniquely engaged as a intellectually apprehending entity. It's talked about in many different ways. You know, the soul can feel, the soul can pine, the soul can thirst, the soul can hunger, the soul can be in pain, in agony. So there are many different riffs on it. But it is especially important for really generating rigorous attention to the ability to understand and to know. And it is one reason why many scholars have critically examined the rationality of Christian theology. Understanding that the tradition is very vast. I've just told you there are lots of it, and not that the soul only thinks, etc. But certainly the emphasis on thinking and reason, ratio, the ability to comprehend divine reason, is very important in the Christian tradition. And the reason is, you know, it's easy to dismiss that and say, well, Christianity is so fixated on reason that it's not really engaged with all of these other faculties that constitute human experience. There is a hegemony of reason, so to speak, in the Christian tradition, so I'm not denying that. But I think it's important in trying to understand the role of reason that we understand these types of roots, that it's also that focus and that emphasis, even if it's an overemphasis, is inspired by a fascinating problem. And that problem is the dualism that's also deeply a part of Christian theology. Not that there have been Christian theologians who've departed from that, but overwhelmingly, that is, we have material over here and the immaterial on this side, where the material represents these limitations in our ability to participate in the spiritual reality. And it's the soul that transcends those limitations. And so if we can sit with some of the observations that lie in this tradition that has been very important, you know, the Aristotelian tradition, of course, arises, it predates Christianity and runs through it. It's the era that it goes through. When Paul, for example, is writing about resurrection, he's trying to understand what he calls, it's often called the debate between the psychics and the pneumatics, who were reading his letters later on, but a physical resurrection and spiritual resurrection. And he talks about physical bodies. Excuse me, he does. He talks about spiritual bodies. How can you have, what is a physical body and what's a spiritual body? And if you're not familiar with this context, it can seem like an oxymoron. A body is supposed to be material. That's why it's a body. The spirit is not supposed to be material. So how can you have a spiritual body? And for Paul, he's trying to figure out this same problem through dualism. And what he comes up with is a body, and he's using the Greek some, but a body that's not actually made of a material entity. And it's because the material is not supposed to be eternal. But he still recognizes the importance of bodily resurrection. But that problem of trying to account for the limitations of physical realities, of physical material, while also recognizing that the range of human experience seems to go beyond what the physical can explain, is with us when we look at those robots on that first slide and say, well, you know, most people would say, of course a machine can't feel. And Descartes again says in the Christian tradition, yeah, but in one iteration of it, the body is a machine. So I'm trying to make several moves in the book, but one of them is to have a greater appreciation for what might sound like an uncritical fixation on dualism. Why can't they just stop insisting on this mind, body, or the physical soul divine? If you understand what they're trying to explain, right, what seems to be a leap, electrical patterns and experience. What your tongue gets whenever it is exposed to chocolate, which is, these cells are just firing off electrical signals. And what we experience as the taste of chocolate, or fill in whatever your favorite food experience is, vanilla, cranberry, tofu, whatever. That experience seems to go beyond what merely physical objects can do, which is why we have trouble with the idea that any machine, no matter how it was ever engineered, could ever feel or want, especially hurt. But we also know that human beings are capable of denying what we might call a human capacity to any human, because we still do it. The United States of America, one of the most enriched countries on the planet in terms of our resources and academic institutions, traditions. We torture people. The CIA has multiple records claiming that victims of torture are not actually feeling pain. We have highly educated experts who will see people crying out and telling them that they're in pain, that they're being tortured. And say, well, you're not, because we have 9 legal experts over here and physiologists who have told us you're not being tortured. Right? So it's not even like this is an old problem. So there is this long tradition of the soul that I am trying to present as a very useful occasion for understanding our human condition today. Even if we don't agree with, you don't have to believe there's a soul. And I'm not trying to promote the idea that there's a soul. I'm actually going in a different direction. But I think that by understanding the theological analysis of the soul, which has been so richly done in Christianity, we can actually be more rigorous in trying to answer the questions that we have today, because they are classic questions. You don't have to end up where these thinkers ended up. But I think we can learn from what Paul was trying to do when he said, well, if there's going to be a bodily resurrection, that has to be a spiritual body. Like, what is a spiritual body? But why is he saying that? And even if you want to disagree with him, I think you have to agree that it looks like there's a leap between that physical and what we're calling the spiritual.
You and I talked about this just before you started. You started with a very interesting example, ended with a couple of very interesting examples. Can you talk a little bit about the whole ethical questions of, even if you accept everything, the synapses and everything, what can we do and what should we do, and how do we get after the ethics of that?
Absolutely, yeah. So a lot of it, we were talking earlier, we were talking about the special role that military research plays. So the 2 people on the end, the implants that they have are products of military research in AI and cybernetics, which is a fancy word for combining people with machine systems. And the aim, there are 2. One major aim, if I can be roughly, divide the waters roughly. One aim was, how can we make it possible for people who have lost capacity due to traumatic brain injury? How can we make it possible for them to walk again, talk again, have memory, have speech capacity, et cetera? The other question was, okay, so if we can put a chip into Ian Burkhardt or Nathan Copeland, what if you could feed the visual data from 5 drones into a trained, modified human soldier with an implant? So they wouldn't need binoculars to see it. They wouldn't have to pull up a video screen to see the video feed from a drone. They could have a visual, an oral, and a haptic, it's a tactile experience of things based on the inputs from these different kinds of devices. Or better yet, what if we could engineer a human with super strength, and we can change their DNA, we can enhance their bodies with these machine systems to make them especially keen in their vision. Not just seeing what a drone sees, but their own vision can be greater than that of an eagle. So that you have this highly sophisticated human army. And what about with the machines themselves? What if we could have such a sophisticated AI system that just as we can do image recognition to detect tumors for cancer patients using AI, because you can train the AI on millions of images and the machine doesn't forget one of those million, not any. It will instantly compare the new one that it sees to the million that it's seen before. A human doctor cannot do that unless maybe you enhance them. Right? But what if we took that kind of capacity and we made it possible for military drones to be able to not only surveil and gather data, but to analyze the data so they can understand what, I'm gonna make this up, you have 100 drones and they're taking data together and they share the data and you run it all through this powerful AI system. And then each of them together can do what's called swarm technology. They share tactics and strategies, and together those 100 drones go out and they deploy some incredibly effective attack against an enemy. And you don't have to have, this is the US fighting, you don't have to have a single US soldier's life in danger. And insert your other country, if it's whatever, Germany, France, Iran, China, Israel, whoever the country is. The countries whose equipment it is says, well, it can save the lives of our soldiers. And I'll use a specific example that's already happened. This was 12 years ago. I was talking to someone at Northrop Grumman who was involved in the machine learning development of their products. And they were asked to develop a ballistic system that could basically hit a bullet with a bullet, that could detect when a projectile was coming to a rocket-propelled grenade, was coming toward an American convoy or this particular vehicle. Target that rocket-propelled grenade with its own projectile and hit it before that first one ever had a chance to injure those American soldiers. And they developed this system using machine learning software. We were talking about human in the loop. So in this specific example, imagine shooting a gun at someone and someone else shoots the bullet from your gun with their bullet to keep your bullet from injuring anyone. Because that's basically what they did. In that example, there is no time for the AI to say, hold on a second, before I fire the bullet to hit the other bullet, I'm gonna call a human and ask them to approve the firing of my secondary bullet. Because if you know why you can't do that, there's no time. This thing is coming and you have maybe a couple seconds. So you take the human out of that loop. So, the question you're asking, what should we do? We are experiencing incredible capacities to do all kinds of things. Most of the cutting edge research that's happening in AI that is the most mind-boggling and amazing is in military research. Lots of people are doing research now in AI. But if you want to know the third rail stuff, look at what's happening in military research, that we can literally change people's bodies, genetically and otherwise, modify. That's where the aim is. And the pressure is real. You might say, well, that sounds really scary and awful. And sure, let's draw the line at a robot hitting another bullet to save human lives. But let's not let these things do anything else. Well, there's no such thing as all the military industrial states in the world getting together and say, okay, none of us are going to do it. The fear is that if you're not number one, you will be number 10. And it doesn't matter if you're the second or the 10th. If you're not number one, if you don't get there first, so hypersonic missiles, another example of this, there's just no time for humans to react, just no time. The only way you can survive in that environment is to hand over decisions to machines. Because if you wait for a human to get in that loop, people are gonna die. So it's a great question you ask. And there are multiple domains where AI is coming, but I think the life or death stuff literally is I think most intense when we think about the military applications and when we consider what's going on in the world right now. It's easy to understand that. What do we hand over to machines? we're still going to have debates about whether or not machines can think. But we should understand that while we're having that debate, decisions are being made. Life and death decisions are being made. And they're being made in part by people and in part by machines. And where we're going right now is that more and more of those decisions are getting made with fewer and fewer humans in the loop.
Hi, thanks so much for a very provocative presentation and just amazing insights. I speak as a non-historian. I'm an English professor here. And my question to you, Sylvester, is about language and the role of language in your study or various forms of language. And when you're talking about Ibn Rushd's question, how do people perceive knowledge, right? This is a very post-structuralist question, right? This is a very Foucauldian question, right? How do we know what we know, right? And post-Derrida, we would argue that we know everything we know through language, right? This is how we form the world around us. So in this scenario you present us with, right, what is the role of human language in relation to artificial language? And how do you see these two coexisting? Thank you.
That's an amazing, very generative question. It's certainly true that language shapes knowledge because of the way the categories get formed conceptually. They are linguistic. And at one level, it will continue to be the case that knowledge, if we're talking about machine knowledge or machine data systems, is going to be shaped by I'm going to say language to make the point of answering your question, but use the specific example of data. So many people have heard the debates about biased AI or algorithmic bias. And the issue is that we can get amazing outputs by training software, not by telling it a bunch of rules, but by showing it a bunch of things. I remember when my niece, who is a grown person now, she was a child, and she asked me what the difference was between a truck. Well, she saw a truck and she called it a car. And I said, well, that's not a car, that's a truck. And she said, well, what's the difference? Now, how would you explain the difference between a car and a truck? That it has four wheels, that it has a bed, because there's some sedans that have a bed. And what would you say? Not all trucks have beds. They come in all shapes and sizes. And I realized that I couldn't actually give her a single example. I just had to point to multiple examples. And that's the whole point behind machine learning. You don't give the AI rules. You show it bunches of examples, hundreds of thousands or even millions. And the data sets, the way you train it will determine what it recognizes. So that, depending on how you train it, it'll be very good at some things and not good at others. Many of you may have heard the example of the soap dispensers that were developed using white people who were in the lab. So the data was calibrated. These machines were calibrated based on lighter skin. So when people with darker skin would go to the soap dispenser, it wouldn't do anything. It was not recognizing anything based on how it was calibrated. So that's not language per se, but it's the same kind of phenomenon. It's the point of this Foucauldian critique, that the very thing that is constituted as knowledge depends on the particularity of whatever the categories are, right? And so that is the AI equivalent of that problem. What I find useful and interesting about these older traditions is that, in Christianity, this knowledge is supposed to be divine. There's this concern for the universal. And the idea is that even though everyone is particular, the truth is not particular. And people have the ability to get beyond their particularity. It's because they have a soul. That's what allows them to, and that's why Ibn Rushd is saying this. He's not, he's elaborating on this tradition. He's not creating the basic idea, he's elaborating on it. But throughout Christian history, the emphasis on divine revelation which has been roundly critiqued, to great ends. But it's easy with our long history of the critiques to lose sight of the urgency of the question that people were asking. Like, why would you even want to say that knowledge has to come from one divine source? And it's not just because people were hierarchical elitists who were against, the demos. It was that it's actually a hard problem. It's how can anyone, so right now, all of you are creating the sound of my voice. You think that the sound is coming from me, but all you're getting is airwaves that move these tiny hairs in your cochlear gland. That's it. I'm vibrating something that's getting transmitted through this mic, and the mic reproduces the vibrations, and it compresses airwaves that vibrate the hairs in your cochlear gland. From there, everything else that happens, you're making it up. You have this electrical pattern, and you interpret that pattern as the sound of my voice, but you're creating that sound. And that's why people can hear different things. Some people have perfect pitch, for example. See, I don't. Some people can sing what we would call on key and others off key. They're getting stimulated by the same thing, but what they do with it is individual. And so with that particularity, do I really have a sound is the question. I think I do. And I'm willing to bet that all of you are hearing something, even though it's different, it's not too far away from one another. And so this question of how do you get, is there a universal? This is why the Christian tradition is focused on the soul and revelation. Like, yes, there is a universal. Okay, well, if all you have is a bunch of different particular individuals, how can anyone ever hope to know the truth? And you don't have to agree with the answer, because I don't. I'm not trying to promote a soul theology. I'm trying to learn from the rigor of the analysis that went into it for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the answer has to be able to account for what looks like a leap and a gap. And what I'm suggesting is that maybe it's not a gap or a leap, but it is a hard problem to solve. And so I think that is the critique of the language knowledge problem is important, but I think it misses a lot of things. Not all knowledge is language. So spiders know how to spin a web. Birds know how to build nests. At least I think they do. Now you can just, the bird doesn't know anything. I think they know something. They never take a class. They never receive the lesson on DVD. The information is in their cells. I had to study and learn how the digestive system works. But before I ever did that, my cells knew how to digest food and regulate my heart rhythm. I think there's knowledge going on that is not linguistic. And I think this is what the theologians understood. They did, they understood that there's something going on that people don't have to learn, and they're not getting it verbally. There's something that transcends that. And that's what is useful about this theology of the soul. You don't have to, I'm not promoting the soul. You don't have to agree with the soul, but just appreciate that what the answer they're trying to solve, we still don't have a definitive answer to it. And we shouldn't feel so smug when comparing ourselves to them.
I'm looking for some kind of spiritual, psychological, therapeutic spin-off of this. Say, for instance, take Martin Luther, 1505, thunderstorm experience. From 1505 to the Privy in 1516, a terrible struggle. Almost he went mad. I mean, is there some implication in all of this to help him to get from A to whatever M, with cutting out some of those steps with some of this research?
Absolutely. And I think one of the implications that is certainly very debatable, and I like the debate, is that there is a commonality across all kinds of differences that can allow for some unified experience of reality. This is precisely what is so fiercely under critique in post-structuralist theory. And I'm not rejecting post-structuralist theory, that would be sloppy. I'm trying to nuance it, okay? But I think one of the takeaways is that even in our existence in what feels like maybe an atomistic experience as individual people, there is still a shared capacity. You can call it consciousness, that some string theorists suggest is a property that is inherent to material things. You can call it a soul. You can call it the apprehension of the divine or the experience of the divine. But I do think one of the implications is that there can be some, call it circumstantial evidence, some affirmation of what people might experience or desire as a connection with something beyond their own individual experience, because that is certainly implied in the circuit that I've tried to give with these different examples. That even though we might feel as atomistic individuals in the universe, there's something that undergirds it all. And so I think that's one implication. It's one implication. I don't know if Luther would find that to be substantial enough to assuage his pain, his existential crisis, but I hope that he would not feel so alone in the world after hearing.
All right, we have 2 minutes left for one last question for one of my students.
Firstly, I'd like to echo others and thank you for this wonderful lecture. And I'd like to ask you if the mystic traditions in Christianity and other Abrahamic faiths would help illustrate this alternative epistemology that you offer, that rather than assigning souls to individual entities, that they all partake in some kind of Godhead, word, soul.
Absolutely. So, very few things. Back to Ibn Rushd, one of the reasons why he was controversial, particularly among his Muslim contemporaries, for many reasons. One was what I pointed to, this secularism that he helped affirm and shape and make popular. He was much more engaged and celebrated in the Christian tradition, actually. Okay? And he had a lot to do with shaping what we now see and what's often called the medieval philosophical tradition. His work was read rather in translation, usually it was in Latin and then some derivative of that. But one of the things that one of the moves that he makes toward the end of his career is precisely what you just said, mysticism. That there was, and this also got him into trouble with some, as the individual soul experiences more and more of divine truth, it starts to look a lot more like the divine itself. And it's almost a type of asymptotic development, So he wouldn't say that the individual became God, but the individual soul, as it continues to experience more and more of the divine, it conforms. It starts to resemble the divine and begins to participate in the same kind of reality, of the ontological reality of the divine. So that if you take that to its logical conclusion, and he carried it pretty far, the individual does participate, theoretically, can participate in divine reality, not just know God, but very closely resemble the stuff of the divine, the soul, the human soul. And he said that because once you accept the premise that truth is objective and that particular individuals can actually have a way to access it, And that the way to do that is that they have a part of them, the soul, that is neither a body nor a power in a body. You know, it's not a colored lens. It is free from any particularity because it's not a material thing. It's a universal kind of thing. And that's why the individual can experience any kind of reality. Softness or hardness or sweetness or sourness or a tree or because it can do anything. It can do anything because it's not particular. And that's the only reason it can do anything. So if you accept that premise, and if everyone has that, and if that is the way that you get to divine knowledge, because it has to become like whatever you're trying to apprehend, which is why it can have particular, then you're sort of almost there anyway. You know, you're already dealing with something that is divine type of nature because that's what God is. God is able to transcend any kind of particularity. God is all things. God is the ultimate truth and reality. And so, yes, can mysticism offer a way? It does, but I don't know if it's different from what he was doing because he became very unpopular among, not all, because there were many Muslim mystics, but many Muslims condemned him for heresy because he seemed to get far too close to blending people with God. But among Christian theologians, he was they just mined his work. And it became very influential in trying to understand what philosophy was capable of. And it helped the Christian tradition to embrace philosophy, not as a rejection of divine revelation, but as a positive and even desirable instrument of divine reception and divine engagement. And it just never stopped being that. You know, the Christian theologians would love theology, would love philosophy. And Ibn Rushd was celebrated for that reason, even if they didn't accept his mysticism.
Well, on that moment of even dangerous transcendence and theosis, we need to bring the evening to a close. So thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Thank you all for being here. That was an extremely robust Q&A, I have to say. I have been asked by Cabell Library to remind all of you that we are in a quiet floor. So when you're leaving and you want to debate the soul and the nature of pain and God, wait until the floor below us, okay? So thank you all very, very much and have a great night and a great weekend. Thank you.